To our scripture lesson for today, back to John's Gospel, to the conclusion of this encounter with Thomas. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have faith in his name. Now, if I were translating this for you, I might not use the words exactly that I've used in the conclusion of John's Gospel. I might translate them this way. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to trust that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through having faith in him, you may have life in his name. Unfortunately, in translating of the scriptures, we have used that word believe far too much, and we think it's only an intellectual thing when it is much more than that. Trust involves heart and mind. We have labeled him Doubting Thomas. We have looked down our noses at him, Doubting Thomas. We have held him up for ridicule, Doubting Thomas. We have judged him severely, Doubting Thomas. With a certain air of spiritual superiority in our voices, we often shake our heads and say, poor old Doubting Thomas just couldn't get things together. And among the 12 disciples, we rank him just above Judas, the betrayer. Many years ago, in a walk through Holy Week, it suddenly came to me that the disciples made Judas their scapegoat. On that last evening at the table, Jesus said to them all, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." Describing their reaction to these words, Mark wrote, "They began to be distressed and say to Jesus, one after the other, 'Surely not I.' Then Jesus, trying to clarify things, said, 'It is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread in the bowl with me.'" They were distressed. Perhaps in the secrecy of their own hearts, each one of these 12 friends of Jesus understood that, yes, I am capable of betrayal. I don't know how you imagine the events of this last evening meal. You may imagine it as just a simple, intimate Passover dinner with Jesus and the 12 disciples, his closest friends. But personally, I have my doubts that it was such an intimate gathering. I personally am convinced that there were more than 12 folks in that upper room that night. I have a hunch that there were at least 40 there that night, maybe more. 40 men and women who had followed Jesus. 40 men and women, all of them wondering if they would be remembered as the one who betrayed their Lord. I believe there was more than 12 there because in response to the voices saying, "Surely not I," Jesus appears to be saying, No, he is not among you. The betrayer is one of the 12 sitting around me. And then he says, the betrayer is even closer. He is one who is dipping his bread in the bowl of wine with me. Well, I personally conclude that from that statement, everyone in the room should have known that the betrayer was one of these four: James or John, Peter or Judas. Those closest to Jesus, those who were of that inner circle. Yet it seems that Judas was not the most suspicious one of the bunch. You see, when he leaves the supper that night, no one considers he might be the betrayer. Everyone is certain that he has gone to complete some errand that Jesus has sent him on. So when Judas became the betrayer, he became their scapegoat and ours too. Peter will deny Jesus. All of them will be scattered through the garden, hoping to save their necks. But it's only Judas who betrays Jesus. Don't you ever find yourself kind of falling back on that when you're doing some sort of inventory of the way your life of faith is going? Things may not be going well. Your devotion, your obedience might be a little shaky, but at least we can say to ourselves, I'm not Judas. I haven't yet betrayed my Lord. Because Judas was the betrayer, they lay all of their guilt on him. He is the scapegoat. He carries their sin of betrayal away. But I don't think those early disciples were finished with their scapegoating when they got done with Judas. No, there's another embarrassment, a deep embarrassment, and they need someone else to carry their sins for them once again. And this time Thomas is the sacrificial lamb. Unfortunately, Thomas was not with the disciples when the risen Christ appeared to them for the first time on Easter evening at dusk in that upper room. His absence is completely unexplained in the gospel. Perhaps, if we let our imaginations wander, perhaps he is still dazed by everything he saw on Friday, and he can't make sense of it, so he's just wandering aimlessly through the streets of Jerusalem, trying to put things together. Or perhaps he's gone back to the garden, where everything first began to go so terribly wrong, and there in the garden, he's trying to sort through all of his shattered dreams. Whatever the reason, Thomas is not there. And when the others come to him and say, Thomas, we've seen the Lord, he gives them a line to be remembered forever. The words of a doubter. Unless I see the mark of nails in his hands, unless I put my finger in the wound in his side, I will not believe. If only Thomas had kept his thoughts to himself, he might not have become the scapegoat for the others. For you see, on that first Easter day, they were all doubters. Every single one of them were seized by doubts, except, according to John's Gospel, maybe John. But remember, that Gospel bears his name. The women who went to the tomb were frightened by the news. They don't believe. They tell the disciples what they have seen and what they have been told, but the disciples don't believe. They dismiss the women as just babbling, foolish women. Mary Magdalene does not believe. She believes that someone must have stolen the body, and when she sees a man in the garden, it must be the gardener who's hidden him. Peter, the old man, runs to the tomb, walks inside, looks around, but he doesn't believe. He simply walks home. The two disciples on the road to Emmaus will not believe what they have experienced until they return to Jerusalem, to the upper room, and hear someone say, "Peter has seen the Lord." They were all locked in a room, afraid perhaps that the authorities were going to do to them what they had successfully done to Jesus on Friday. Or perhaps they were afraid the authorities were going to appear at the door and ask them where they had taken and hidden the body of Jesus. The authorities knew that there might be some deception about whether or not this Jesus of Nazareth had truly risen from the dead. No, not a single one of them is any better than Thomas when it comes to believing what happened on that first Easter morning. They are all held hostage by their doubts. Even after Easter, after multiple encounters with the risen Lord, Simon decides to go back to his fishing business, recruiting some new partners from Jesus' former disciples. And they go back to the sea, back to their boats, back to their nets, back to fishing, just as if life was exactly like it was before. And this seems to be absolutely true. If Peter believed, if John believed, they had no idea what resurrection meant because they went back to fishing. So Thomas became their scapegoat and our scapegoat, forever to be mentioned like this: Thomas, the doubter, doubting Thomas. Recently, I have begun to wonder why, after all of these centuries, do we still need Thomas as our scapegoat? Why are we still so reluctant to acknowledge that despite our love and our faithfulness to Jesus, there are moments in many days when we find that doubts are lingering in the life around us? If you listen carefully to Jesus, when he engages his disciples after resurrection, he doesn't chastise them for doubting. He doesn't say to them then, as he had on other occasions, "You folks of such little faith, how long am I going to have to put up with you?" He didn't say that at all after resurrection. But this is what he does. He comforts a weeping and doubting Mary. He opens the Scriptures to those two doubting ones on the road to Emmaus. He follows doubting Peter home and then to the sea. He enters the upper room with all of those doubters and he says, "Peace be with you." And finally to Thomas he says, "Put your finger here into my hands. Reach out your hand, touch my side. Do not doubt, but have faith." We may ridicule him. We may look down at him. We may judge him. But Jesus does not. Jesus does not judge doubting Thomas. Jesus does not hold him up before the others as an object of ridicule. No. Jesus offers Thomas exactly what he had offered the others on that first Easter night. A chance to see and a chance to touch his wounds. And perhaps we have become so hung up with our scapegoat, doubting Thomas, that we've never noticed that it is Thomas who is the first to say, "My Lord and my God." My Lord and my God. Thomas, the doubting one, is the first. I wonder why we need doubting Thomas as our scapegoat. For if it appears to me, if you consider all the different reactions to the news of resurrection by those first disciples, doubt has to become the prelude to faith. Their doubts are there for us to see long before they come to grips with their risen Lord. And because they doubted, and their doubting is so noticeable for us in the Gospels, I wonder why we have such difficulty with our doubting. It's obvious that when doubts arise in us about matters of faith, most of us become frightened or anxious. Sometimes when we discover there's a lingering doubt in our hearts or minds, we have these feelings of guilt and shame, as if someone has slapped our hand. And if our doubts begin to show some real sign of betrayal, we suddenly draw the conclusion that we simply never believed at all. Regretfully, we have a tendency to make our faith and our doubts polar opposites, as if faith is always over here and doubts are always over here. But the truth of the matter is, if anyone lives a life of faith, this is where doubt and faith are to be found. Together, present, sustaining and strengthening to one another. If you doubt, if you have doubts, you can't have faith, is what we want to say to the doubter. Yet this morning, I'm willing to stake my life on this fact, that doubts become the incubator of faith. If we tend to reject and deny our doubts, I'm willing to bet my life this morning that doubt is absolutely essential to a living and meaningful faith. If we tend to judge doubters while never looking critically at the assumptions of faith we have made, I'm willing to bet my life on this, that my doubting brother or sister has something to show me about faith. I think time is long overdue for us to find some grace for doubting Thomas and for ourselves. Grace for our brothers and sisters who live perhaps daily with their doubts, maybe some of us included. Our friends who wrestle honestly and openly with their doubts rather than deny them or sweep them under the rug, or just go along for the sake of going along with people who seem to know more than they know, subjecting themselves to false claims that they just can't get their minds and their hearts around. Across the years, I've become convinced that we spend too much time playing with faith up here in our heads, in our minds. We have this temptation to reduce faith to a set of beliefs we pledge our allegiance to. We want to believe that there are certain things to believe, and if you defy those things, you're not a true believer. And most regrettably, over the years, I've met those folks who think they have to stop thinking, stop using their minds in order to be people of faith. I've never been so thankful in my life as I am today for Paul Brewer, who took a young freshman into his philosophy of religion class at Carson Newman College and stood before me with courage to say to the entire class, do not be afraid of truth. Wherever you find truth, it belongs to God. No more liberating word has ever been spoken to Jamie Broom, the doubting one. I also think there may be another criterion we ought to consider when it comes to faith and doubts and our struggles. This week I thought of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And maybe I thought of him because I think one day this past week marked 70 years since this young Lutheran theologian was led from his cell where Hitler had placed him by executive decree to be hung only hours before the Allied forces arrived that would have liberated him. He writes, the following two propositions hold good and are equally true. Only he who believes is obedient, and only he who is obedient believes. You see, those of us, despite our uncertainty or our doubts, who find the faith to obey, despite all of our doubts, we do believe because we are trusting Jesus in the way. And all of us who obey without necessarily believing, we are following Christ in the way, or if we are uncertain about our beliefs. Whenever people ask me about Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, I say, read it with this warning. You will never be the same kind of follower of Jesus if you do. Sometimes we think that this matter of faith is believing certain doctrines, certain things about God that sometimes we find difficult to believe. But I want to say to you this morning that this is not where my real doubts come to play. And maybe they're not where your real doubts come to play either. But here's where I find myself to be a doubting Thomas. Contemplate. Is God's love truly unconditional? Sometimes when I've messed up, when I've left a wake of destruction in my path, I wonder, I doubt, does He truly love me without condition. I'm afraid to trust. I doubt. Sometimes when I am so crumpled and distorted by the things I have done wrong, the sins I have committed, and the ignorance out of which I've chosen to live, I doubt that confession and forgiveness can truly set me free. I'm afraid to trust. I doubt. And when by word or action I've mangled a relationship and it looks like it's shattered forever, I wonder. But I'm afraid and I cannot trust, I doubt, that forgiveness can truly make it new. In the world in which we are living today, where there's too many wars and too much violence, I wonder if it's possible to live as a peacemaker in the world, bringing people together rather than creating enemies of one another. But I'm afraid to trust. I am a doubter. In a world in which the powers that be, the governments and the presidents and the prime ministers and folks seem to have all the power in the world, is there truly a power greater than the powers of this world? I'm afraid to trust. I am a doubter. Last year, as we were looking to go to Quincy, and all of the turmoil going on in Ukraine and with Crimea, I sat here believing with all of my heart that the day was going to come when the Russian government would say, no Americans can come again. I was talking to Lucy, and Lucy kept saying to me, Jamie, don't be afraid. Trust. Don't doubt. The situation was more critical than when you came in 1996 than it is today. And the door was open. I learned a lesson last year, despite my fear, despite my doubts, to trust. This year, it's been Lucy who's been afraid. The economic situation there is dire. For the first time since the Soviet Union fell, she has to send money to her parents so that they can survive. Their money is worth half what it was today. The political crackdown in some places is real. I thought that President Putin would have his way and we wouldn't be able to go to Quincy this year. But guess what? Over the last several weeks, President Putin has grown strangely silent. For 2 solid weeks in the Russian press, they wondered what happened to him. But that bellicose, angry Putin we've seen in recent weeks, for some reason, has retreated for a while. And so, I sent a letter to Yevgeny, and he returned that letter within 12 hours. Dear Jamie, he writes, I am very glad to receive a letter from you. I agree that a lot has changed in the world, but our Lord is unchangeable. As unchangeable are the relationships He built between us. No matter what happens in the world, no matter how the relations between our governments change, we are brothers in Christ, and our local churches belong to the one church of Jesus Christ. Myself, my family, our whole church were gladdened and inspired by your desire to be with us this summer, to serve the Lord together, to worship Him together. I gave greetings from you to our church, to our congregation at the worship service on Thursday night, which was Maundy Thursday for them, as we gathered for the Lord's table. I believe your visit is possible. That is a resurrection message. That is a word beyond our doubts to faith and to trust. You remember those words at the end of John that I read a minute ago and changed them up just a bit? John, in summing up what he has done in this gospel, says, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book." Which means Jesus did a lot more than what we read in John's gospel. But he says, "These are written so that you may come to believe or to trust that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through having faith you may have life in his name." I propose to you this morning that doubting Thomas is one of those signs that can inspire in us faith beyond our doubts and beyond our fears. And Thomas brings the good news that doubt is the prelude of faith. Doubt may be where faith begins, but let us see doubts as a gift of God's grace.